I visited your beautiful campus, and I want to first thank Irene for inviting me here, and the president of the university, President Hodges, and other colleagues. And so it's a big pleasure to be here. I also want to thank my wife, Hilaria Bottigliero, Dr. Hilaria Bottigliero, who's sitting there, for coming and for bringing our two kids, who are 10 years old, Kailash and Satya, who's 8 years old, because they're overdue for indoctrination in liberal democratic theory. So it's, at this age, they should already have it down completely, solid. It's also important that, the grandparents are here, or Marcella Innocenti and Vincenzo Bottigliero. You see, my roots, I'm Canadian, but my roots go back to India, to the Punjab, and my wife's Italian. So you would expect that we also bring the great-grandparents and the cousins and all the uncles and some people from the village. And this big, enormous group, but for practical reasons, this was not practical. In addition, Hilaria is she's one of the directors at the International Development Law Organization, with a very similar background to mine in international criminal law, international humanitarian law, and human rights. So it means that we can rely on each other for expertise. For example, just 2 evenings ago, I said, darling, could you please check over my PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to be giving at the American University of Rome, as you know. She said, yes, darling, I've already done it. And what do you think? And she said, well, it's consistent. It's consistent all the way through, and it's consistent also with your other presentations that you've made elsewhere. I thought, oh, that's great. It's consistent in the fact that it lacks any logic whatsoever. so I said, oh, well, okay. But if I respond to this criticism, she will say, I'm only saving you. I'm only trying to save you from yourself. So we will proceed on that basis and get to the presentation in a moment. I would also say that it's unfortunate for me that I didn't get a chance to meet Professor Walston, because I know of his work and I know of his legacy with students and colleagues, and the warmth that he gave to his work, and of course his very sharp insights into international relations and to Italian politics. And I've dug up some of his work and interviews on the YouTube, and it's very impressive, and I would have learned a lot from an interaction with him. So I'm very humbled to have been asked to speak in his honor. So without further ado, let's maybe get to the substance of the matter. What is democracy without human rights or the rule of law? And I hope we'll be able to see this. But in any case, there, it's good enough, I think. So it's not just a rhetorical question, and you were pointing that out, Professor Cartelli. It is also important that the quality of governance affects individual liberty and security, and international relations and diplomacy. Because we can think of these things in the abstract, but obviously it has a very strong impact on daily life. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that democratic governance has been coming under strain lately from terrorism and cyber war, xenophobia, racism, sexism, religious discrimination, counterterrorism and surveillance. But I would also say rising socioeconomic inequality, and over-concentration of wealth, foreign interference in elections. Been hearing a lot about that in the news, as well as territorial interference, not just cyber war, but also armies going into other lands. Fake news, blurring of news and opinion. Increasing jingoism and authoritarianism. And I would also add weak control by the civilian power over the military. So weak civilian control over the military. If it's the military on its own, and you don't have civilian control, there's a military logic that can creep in. Militarism, authoritarianism, just very bad for democracy. So people have worried about good governance since 2,000 years BC. We can think of the ancient instructions from the king Ketil around, like I said, 2,000 years BC, on how to rule to a successor, to Merikari. And you also have, of course, Plato and Aristotle have debated the merits and demerits of democracy since a long time ago. Well, let's maybe canvass a little bit of the opinion of the sages. Socrates ventured that a democracy, I suppose, he says, comes into being when the poor, winning the victory, put to death some of the other party. It's a good idea. It sounds like if you win, you might as well kill some people. Drive out others, and grant the rest of the citizens an equal share in both citizenship and offices. Actually, we have some democracies where sometimes you do see violence and there are deaths. But Socrates is being known for his sarcasm. So, if you read Plato's Republic. Aristotle says less sarcastically that democracy is about people taking turns at ruling and being ruled, so that everyone becomes equal in that sense. But he also warned that where the people govern and not the law, you end up with demagoguery. You find that, the opinion spelled out in his Politics. Thomas Jefferson said a democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49. James Madison was even less optimistic. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. It's quite a harsh opinion. According to Lord Acton, the one prevailing evil of democracy is the tyranny of the majority. I sound like an anti-democratic person so far with all these quotes. Or rather, that party, not always the majority, that succeeds by force or fraud in carrying elections. You can steal the elections. The power is yours. Winston Churchill remarked, "The best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter." So, He also quipped, however, democracy is the worst form of government, except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. So, it's bad, but everything else is worse. I think most of us are probably familiar with at least some of those quotes. Well, democracy might bring to mind voting in elections, voting in parliament and the legislature, political parties, campaigns, free press, debate. We'll see what happens in the second round coming up in France. Or direct voting as in Appenzell, which is quite a scene to behold. I lived in Switzerland for 13 years. It's a charming place to be. not in Appenzell, but the only difficulty there is that women could not vote in local elections until 1991. There was a Supreme Court decision from Switzerland. So that's rather disturbing. But at least they came around to the right position after a long time. Well, democracy might also bring to mind uprisings in history, for example, from the ancient Babylonian revolts against the Assyrians, the Helot slave revolt against Spartan masters, surrender of the Qing dynasty to the Han dynasty founder, or the Zanj rebellion of black African slaves in Iraq, Skanderbeg's rebellion in Ottoman-ruled Albania. I was giving some lectures in Tirana, and they have a big sculpture there, and some of these things are very contentious. Some people will say, yeah, it's not democratic, it's an uprising. Each one of these is, of course, quite debatable. How democratic are these popular movements? The English Revolution, or Sikh revolts against the Mughal emperors back in the 1670s. Well, we can complete the story a little bit with the Age of Revolution, and the American Revolution, French Revolution, Haitian Revolution with the Slave Rebellion, Spanish-American Wars of Independence, or nationalist liberal revolutions, of course, which are famous from 1848. In the last 100 years, we have, it's interesting. This year, we're supposed to be celebrating, wherever we are, the October Revolution, Bolshevik Revolution, that brought about into the USSR. And in Russia, the Kremlin is downplaying it for a lot of reasons. It's an interesting thing. You don't see a lot of celebrations. You don't see mention of it. And there are a lot of reasons for that. They look at me very knowingly, like, yes, I have reasons why. I can read your mind. 1921 Ukrainian Revolution. The Mexican Revolution, you don't see the picture very well, but it's women and girls with guns, and they fought very hard in the Mexican Revolution. Throughout the 1940s, 50s, 60s, anti-colonial revolutions in Africa and Asia, Cuban or Hungarian revolutions, Tibetan uprising against China, Bangladesh Liberation War, Iranian Revolution, Philippines Revolution, all the revolutions post-USSR, Poland, Hungary, German Democratic Republic, Czech Republic, Euromaidan, and of course the Arab Spring. And it was quite impressive to see all those movements happening, and also the involvement of other powers outside the region, which way they would support things, and what are the results, whether they could be seen as satisfactory. Lots and lots of debates. Despite its, that's just Tahrir Square in Cairo, despite its flaws, democracy is more prevalent than ever, but perhaps less appreciated by younger generations. I want to put some graphs up that I think kind of show this. For example, if you look 1816 to 2015, you see, let's see if I get this light on here. Yeah. A rise, obviously, in the population of the world, which used to be only 1 billion, now it's up to 7. This is the part of the population of the world living under democracy, and something called anocracy, which is kind of partial democracy, or even authoritarian democracy, still going up. So all this represents more or less very democratic, people under democratic rule. So the proportion in the world population has gone up quite a lot. And these are still, these are autocracies, this part here. So the proportion of the world's population living under democracy or partial democracy has gone up a lot since, the last 200 years. And since 1946, we see that these two graphs here, you have democracy, which is the blue line here, and autocracies have dropped off quite a lot. And partial democracy, right, this green line, it's also going up. Now, how do you measure democracy? That's a whole other debate, but there's a consensus that, voting, elections, free media, and people come up with pretty much more or less the same indicators. But, how you call it, whether this is a democracy or that's democracy, there's always room for debate. But let me go a little further here. This shows also a map of democracies around the world and other forms of government. Oops, shoot. I just put it on black, so I think I have to put it back. There we go. The wrong button? Push it again. And here you have Norway comes at the top. This is the Economist Intelligence Unit, which does quite a big rating of democracies around the world, according to around 67 indicators. And they're quite sophisticated, and I appreciate their work very much. What it shows is that you have a lot of democracies here, but also India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Southern Africa area, in Europe and Latin America. There's quite a lot of fully or partial democracies in the world. In terms of, let's say, geography or number of governments, in terms of population, China is still very weak in terms of democracy, at least according to some indicators. It's something we can always debate. What I think is also interesting is that this graph shows the appreciation for democracy. And if you're born in the 30s, you have a very high respect in these countries. These are just the sample countries. They happen to be all Western democracy countries. But I think it's interesting that if you're born in the 30s, you have very high, you put a high value on democracy. But if you're born in the 1980s, you likely have far less appreciation for it. In other words, depending on how old you are, there's a tendency whether how much you appreciate or how much you take for granted is another way to think of it. Democratic governance. And I think that's interesting. It's also very frightening, maybe I'm the wrong generation, maybe I'm too old. But to think that younger people might not appreciate democracy as much as my cohort. So that one can also consider might be a kind of a threat to democracy if it's unappreciated. Or maybe it's a good thing, it'll spur people on to improve. Well, all the movements that I listed as examples, and I could have listed many more, these popular uprisings and everything else, they remind us that wherever in the world the demos, the people, sees as kratos, power to rule, demokratia can be powerful, even revolutionary, liberating, but in some instances oppressive. So what happens when democracy goes wrong? Let's take an example, 1924 elections in Italy. Mussolini won 2/3 of the vote. It's a lot. Whether you count it under the old electoral rules or the newly enacted charitable law. 1932, Hitler won German elections with 40% of the vote. Much more than any other party. So President Hindenburg really had to, in January 1933, appoint him chancellor in a minority government. This was through democratic processes. Constitutional democratic processes, without proper checks and balances, opened the way for fascist and National Socialist rule. This was democracy without human rights or substantive rule of law. So kind of democracy, at least at the beginning. We know that Germany invaded Poland on 1st of September 1939, starting World War II. and unleashing violations of unprecedented scale and severity, which shattered global peace and security. And we're talking, by International Committee of the Red Cross estimates, around 60 million killed, half in the USSR alone. Direct, intentional targeting of civilians. Genocide of Jews, Roma, and Sinti, I should put Sinti, not Sinti, and systematic persecution of other groups. We have, of course, Nazi death camps, Hitler's ovens, systematic murder, torture, rape, massive destruction of cultural property, churches, mosques, synagogues, art, destruction of cities, towns, and villages. That's Rotterdam, not far from where we live in The Hague, where those people, these are people standing here, and they're taller than all of the surrounding areas because it's been bombed so badly that there's nothing standing. So that was Rotterdam, you know, not too far from The Hague in the Netherlands. But you also have, let's not forget, atomic bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 6 and 8 August 1945. Billions of dollars of property damage. Violation of the sanctity of treaties and rupture of friendly international relations. Obviously I can go on and on, but the point is that World War II made it really shockingly clear that dictators, even if they are democratically elected, could use their power to change, ignore, manipulate rules of the game, persecute populations, inside and outside their countries, destroy human rights and the rule of law, plunge the whole world into armed conflict. Well, in the Atlantic Charter, which is called the Atlantic Charter because it was signed by Roosevelt and Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland on this boat in 1941, during the Second World War, they envisioned a post-war order that promoted the right of all peoples to self-determination, global economic cooperation, advancement of social welfare, a world free of want and fear, general disarmament. So, I want to bring in international human rights law to the stage to say that it was developed, this huge system that I'm going to talk a little bit about for a few minutes, was developed in the immediate aftermath of World War II in reaction to Axis power violations and manipulation of democracy to serve very illiberal ends. So in a way, democracy has a very, very direct connection with the whole rise of international human rights law. I mean, this is one of the rallies, the Nuremberg rallies on Zeppelin Field in 1937. It just makes you wonder, where would these movements have been without so much people power behind them? They're in some way democratic in the sense of the numbers of people involved. Prior to World War II, states considered human rights as their own business, really nobody else's business, and as falling within exclusive domestic jurisdiction. Now, states did take notice of human rights beyond their borders. They did do that. It's not like they ignored them completely. For example, in the 1930s, some governments complained about what was happening in Nazi Germany and what was happening in Italy and in other countries. But they could only complain on a moral or political or diplomatic grounds, not on the basis of law, because international human rights law did not yet exist. It didn't exist before 1945. You had some minority rights guarantees and some treaties, international labor law since 1919, but international human rights law did not exist otherwise. So throughout the 30s, Hitler and Mussolini increasingly abused the rights of their own nationals, first at home and then abroad. Am I going too fast, too slow? Is that okay? Ready? Yeah? Any violent objections at this point? Otherwise, we'll take questions at the end. You never know. Somebody might say, hey, I just don't agree with the whole thing. We'll see at the end. Following the end of World War II, the drafters of the UN Charter made the UN's first purpose maintenance of international peace and security. Why? Because it's just after so much war, they didn't want the world to slip back into war. But they also recognized that serious human rights violations could lead to war and threaten international peace and security. So there's a very strong connection between respect for human rights and peace, violations and instability and war, full-out armed conflict. Also, that human rights were too important to be left completely to individual governments. You can't leave human rights just, they shouldn't stop at the border and something more universal. So human rights have to be legally enforceable, not just something you talk about in a coffee shop. What do you feel your human rights are, et cetera, et cetera. Have to be legal rights and protected universally. Therefore, human rights have to be protected by international law. In other words, by international human rights law. That's the logic of it. And that's why in the UN Charter, you see it's actually prominently placed in Article 1.3 of the Charter of the United Nations. Out of all the things you could mention, it's there. Now, I just want to put a caveat that otherwise I will be accused of wearing rose-colored glasses. I mean, the vision that I just spelled out, it's an important one, but it clashed immediately with the realities of all these things. American imperialism and interventionism, Stalinist persecution going on at the time of minorities and political opposition, European colonial domination, throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Churchill was arguing that self-determination only applied to European populations under the Nazi yoke, whereas President Roosevelt said, wait a second, it should apply to everyone anywhere. You should always have the right to govern yourself. And Churchill said in the House of Commons, I have not become the King's first minister to preside over the dissolution of the British Empire. So saying that, colonies we could talk about, but in Europe, self-determination is important. And today we see a UN Security Council in action in the face of mass violations. It's not like it's a rosy, happy world out there in all these places. My point is that Immanuel Kant's vision of perpetual peace is nowhere on the horizon. We have a lot of bloodshed. All you have to do is turn on the television. Well, nobody watches television anymore. But check the internet stories and it's obvious how much violence there is. But we still have to admit that today, the UN's collective security apparatus has an impressive, although imperfect, peace enforcement and peacekeeping record. There's also a marked drop in the incidence of international armed conflicts. It used to be most of human history, especially when there was the state system, there's been international armed conflict. Now it's rather rare. There are very few. Okay, civil wars there are there. A marked drop in battle deaths, despite everything you see, Afghanistan, Iraq, Rwanda, Syria, if you count them up. The number of deaths in battle has dropped a lot, even counting all those killings. A marked drop in extreme poverty and disease, and a rise in living standards. Extreme poverty, not poverty in general, but extreme poverty has been cut in half. Now it's defined as $1.25 per day, but it's something that extreme poverty has been cut in half. And there are a number of diseases that are on the verge, they're difficult to completely eradicate, but they're on the verge of eradication. Per capita GDP by world region is way up. We're way wealthier collectively. The GDP is a very rough thing. Since the difference is 1820 compared to the year 2000, there's a huge increase in wealth. More important than just GDP, which doesn't talk really about distribution within a country, is that many countries have become more skilled at turning GDP into satisfaction, well-being, human well-being. There's all sorts of charts you can find. So that's really what matters. Now, international human rights law has become hugely successful in many ways because every state has ratified at least one multilateral human rights treaty. Shows that all states recognize it. They recognize its validity and application, and the principle of its normative superiority to national law. You can't plead. Government leaders still do it, but they try sometimes. It's much more difficult to plead with any level of persuasion that your national constitution, your statutes, your national policies take somehow some precedence over international norms. You can't say, well, we passed a law that says genocide's okay, or torture's okay. We have some debates recently about torture, unfortunately, which is hard to imagine that's coming up, but okay. It's much more, the whole tendency has been, whereas torture was much more normal, now it's seen as something taboo, or almost taboo. The UN Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Treaty bodies, there's a whole bunch of bodies out there that now monitor, report, investigate human rights from the international side and look at the whole range of human rights. So it's a huge phenomenon. Not only that, I just want to add a few more points about this, without belaboring it too much, to say that human rights as a culture has spread all around the world. The Declaration of Human Rights, which if you haven't read it, is interesting reading, has got the Guinness Book of World Records for being the most translated document in the world, in the most number of languages. There are hundreds of national human rights institutions, hundreds of thousands of NGOs, and people working on human rights everywhere. So it's a big success in a lot of ways. We also have the International Court of Justice, which was first founded in 1919, but that has got a higher caseload in terms of peaceful dispute resolution. We have an International Criminal Court, it's a couple of kilometers from where we live in The Hague, and all sorts of bodies now that are looking at targeting individuals for serious human rights violations under international law. So they can't just use their governmental powers and their own laws to commit any violations that they like. The human rights system is far from perfect because every government, I haven't seen one government that doesn't lie about its human rights practices. And I say this, lecturing in 55 countries and been all sorts of places. I always say that. It's just a fact. Or they try to minimize shortcomings in human rights. And different countries apply double standards. But the UN and regional human rights monitoring, investigation, reporting work does work because governments still remain quite sensitive to criticism on human rights, and they care about their human rights image and reputation, maybe for the wrong reasons. Maybe it's only for trade deals, tourism, arms deals, etc., greater international influence. But it matters, is my point. Now, international law, however, says little about democracy. Democracy is hardly covered. And the reason for that is that states could not agree in human rights instruments to more than some very diluted, anodyne language. A general right to take part in the government. So, very little. The people's will is the basis for the authority of government. And elections and voting. Now, why do you think that might be? It's because none of that conflicts with military juntas and their elections. Remember when we were at the United Nations, they're representative of governments. If many of those governments are non-democratic, they're not going to agree to say that human rights includes a right to full democracy, full elections and proper human rights, etc. They're just going to put the minimum. Otherwise they're implicated. And so you have the lowest common denominator at the international level. And elections, if you have a military junta and you run an election, that's easy to rig. You can call it democracy. Marxist, Leninist, one-party systems doesn't conflict with this. That supposedly channel the workers' will through local Soviets. In a lot of ways it is democratic, if it's correctly done. But one party, I was teaching in Beijing one time, at Peking University Law School. I said, sorry, but you don't have a democracy. You only have one choice. So at least you have to have another choice. You have democracy in a lot of ways. There's debate within the National People's Congress. There are all sorts of ways of discussing things, but there are big limits. Even in Western democracies, elections haven't kept big money or corporate influence out of political decision making. There's the National People's Congress in China. Also, elections can be used for one man, I put one man for a reason, one vote, one time. That's what the idea of the Front Islamique de Salvation in Algeria was. Vote for us, and once we're in power, we'll get rid of democracy. So one man, one vote, one time. And then the military took over in Algeria. The West didn't say anything that you're overthrowing a democratic. It was clear they were going to win. The Western countries didn't say anything. For months they were on the wrong side of democracy, but they, on the other hand, didn't want to see extremism. And that's what you can have. A few more slides and then we're going to open it up for questions. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that everyone has the right to take part in the government, right of equal access to public service, the will of the people, genuine elections, universal, equal, pretty minimalistic. And it's the same in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a binding, legally binding multilateral convention. It says almost word for word the same thing. There is the principle of self-determination. You might think, well, doesn't that, bring in democracy in some way? And that's spelled out in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and these other instruments. Problem is, self-determination means really just a people's right to be sovereign and independent, free from colonialism, self-governing, but not necessarily through what we would recognize as democratic government. So self-determination doesn't help that much. And that's an important norm, principle of law in politics, in the UN system, but it doesn't carry much in terms of democracy. The rule of law helps safeguard democracy. Ever since the Magna Carta, 1215, the rule of law, at least in a formalistic sense, means law is supreme, no one is above the law, everyone is equal under and before the law. And that, you can say, prescribes, if you want to pull more out of it, it prescribes non-discrimination. Limited discretionary powers of public officials, separation of powers and balance of powers, accountability, transparency, predictability, prospective application of law, not that you pass a law and that applies backward in time, especially criminal law. You do something on Tuesday and then Wednesday you pass a law, and Thursday you're liable for it. That's not fair. So it doesn't give you a lot of human rights content, the rule of law. Although more recently, some thinkers, and prominent thinkers, have been widening the concept out to say, listen, rule of law really implies much more in terms of substantive human rights guarantees civil and political rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. Lord Acton reminds us that all power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That implies a need for checks and balances, as Montesquieu advocated, institutional separation of powers, civilian control over the military, and that the quality of democratic governance should be measured, and here's really the point I'm making for the whole talk. We have to measure democratic governance by the degree to which, or how well, it promotes and protects human rights at home and abroad, free speech, free media, freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief, and all the other human rights. So human rights has to be the indicator for democratic governance. And also for the rule of law, peace and friendship among nations, not just national security. We're hearing a lot about national security every day. National interests or national sovereignty. This kind of nationalism tendency is fine in some ways, and in other ways it's completely retrograde. It is no coincidence that the strongest democracies guarantee human rights, rights of women, very important, rule of law, fully and comprehensively. And there you see a list of the world's strongest democracies. And that's the old other chart that we had on before, just to remind you that they are scattered in other regions as well. I think it's interesting that currently 10 women are heads of state, very few, and 9 as head of government. In Rwanda, you have, I've been many times there, 63.8% seats of the lower house are held by women. That's because the Constitution guarantees a quota there. And there's a lot of empowerment right now of women in Rwanda, which is a great thing. In 38 states, less than 10% of the MPs in the single or lower houses are women. And in 4 chambers, there's no women at all. So, you get this chart. I didn't make this chart. I'm just dealing stuff off the internet right and left, okay? Intellectual property violation. UN Women. This comes from UN Women. But I think it's interesting. It says, we've seen a big increase. 1995 to 2015, number of women in parliament has nearly doubled. But that's still only 22% of women in parliament today. And this information is good as of January 2017. But, there's progress. So, what is democracy without human rights or the rule of law? It is, maybe some of the sages had a lot of insight. It is demagoguery and mob rule, tyranny of the majority, power unchecked, tendency of getting an intimidation of the media, stifling of political dissent, disregard for minority rights, individual rights and freedoms, arbitrary use of power which opens the way for corruption and impunity. Impunity is when you're not punished for crimes. There's no punishment. Illiberal authoritarian rule that tends towards dictatorship. Inclination towards racism, xenophobia, nationalism, and militarism. Once you get if you don't push human rights, then you want to draw on the reservoir of popular support for your government. You tap into some of these prejudices and hatred and things that you can find in the population. So, what is democracy without human rights or the rule of law? It's fake democracy. Thanks very much. Do we take questions right away?
No.
Are we It's up to you. No, I would love to. Any questions?
Would anyone like to ask the first question?
Don't be shy.
Could I ask you just to...
We're going to give you the microphone because it'll be...
Okay, I can shout.
I can shout too. But I have a microphone.
Yeah, with a sparring match. I noticed that in one of the world's democracies on the map, that the United States, since we're here, the United States was cast as in the colour of flawed democracy.
That's right.
Whereas, Captain, would you like to expatiate a bit on that?
Yes, I could. The Economist Intelligence Unit that does this very good analysis, and also some other organizations, have considered that the United States should be downgraded in the last few years to a flawed democracy. And I share the opinion, by the way. I think it's correct. You might say, oh, it's because of Trump. You know, that's a reaction one could have. But they notice, and they state very clearly in the reports, and you can find it online, is that this tendency was well along the lines, you know, it was well along this path before Trump even started campaigning.
Well, I don't doubt it. If anything, I'm surprised.
And let me go a little further on it. So, you know, the United States Constitution is a really impressive document, and so are all the workings and the sophistication of the laws, the balance of powers, separation of powers, the incredible jurisprudence that's in the Supreme Court, the election system, the vibrant, you know, way the democracy is practiced in the US is studied all around the world as it should be. It's got so much, so rich. So why has it been downgraded to, let's say, by some people, to a flawed democracy? I think for me, the answer comes very much from Francis Fukuyama, who wrote on this some years back.
Yeah.
And he noted that the balance of powers is so balanced that it's hard to govern. It's often said that the United States president is not so powerful because he or she could do less with his or her power than you see, for example, a prime minister in the parliamentary system of the United Kingdom. So there's so many checks and balances that you got to a point where to pass a budget or to confirm a judge, it's become more difficult. Partially because of several factors. One of them is polarization of ideological spectrum. So the middle ground, the shared values seems to have dissipated, or let's say disappeared quite a lot. So we're seeing, you know, more extremist positions on polarization in public opinion. That makes it more difficult. And the other thing is, you know, there's been a lot of debate over the Electoral College, for example. Is it out of date? We saw that Hillary Clinton got many more votes, not many more, but enough to win on the popular vote. But by the Electoral College, you have Iowa or Oklahoma, 500,000 people, having, for example, in the Senate, 2 seats that always go Republican, compared to California, which has 24 million people. In other words, 50 times more. You know, in the Senate elections. So some of these are may be considered distortions in the sense that the original system may have been well balanced, but with the population the way it's gone and gerrymandering, you know, and some other things, it has become very difficult to govern and to pass laws and to rule effectively. I would add also that civilian control of the military has dropped quite a lot, even during the Obama years and before that, probably since Reagan. The reason is that the military has become very strong in the US, as Eisenhower warned in, 1940, 1959, he said it, right? 59, 57, I think it was, could be one or the other. He said, beware the military-industrial complex. It has become very important, but it's also because the civilian authority, the White House and Congress and the Senate have said, you know, for all our engagements internationally, who can get these things done? It's not the State Department, it's the Pentagon. And there's been a trend in the budget. If you look at the State Department budget, and it's 1,000 people or so, and you look at the budget of the military, there's a huge disbalance. And it's not the military's fault, it's the fault of the system and the decision-making over time. So I think that's another factor. So there's a number of things that make the US at present, I would say, a flawed democracy, which could always hopefully regain its full stature with some reforms, I would say. But does that answer your question? Yeah. Anybody else? Do you have any? Yes. Yes.
Thank you. When I was in the Soviet Union, as it was then,
What year were you there?
that's 1989, I think.
1989.
Yeah.
Okay.
Talking to people there, I made the observation you made in China that you guys don't really have a democracy, you have elections. And the man I was talking to said, well, we have factions within the Communist Party. I mean, there's a candidate who stands for this ideal, for that ideal. You can choose which one you want to vote for, but whichever one you vote for, it'll be a communist. And I said, well, my point exactly. And he said, yeah, when you have an election in England, which was where I was living at the time, you can vote Tory, Liberal, Labour, but whoever you vote for, he's going to be a capitalist. So it's just the same thing. It was, now obviously there's an awful lot of discussion that can arise from that, but the point is that it's a question of how we define the options that are made available in a well-organised, perfectly formulated democracy, such as the one that we would all like to live in. And we see now, I think, in some countries, that because politicians poll for public opinion as a means of formulating their policies, rather than formulating their policies on their ideals and offering the public a menu of a range of possibilities, because they see power before necessarily the benefit of the state. The democracy, whole sections of populations are disenfranchised in what would be, what undoubtedly is a perfectly well-organised democracy that does have human rights, does have the rule of law, but still is a fake democracy. And I wondered if you have any observations to make on that.
Well, my observation is basically to agree fully with everything you've said. Because, and I think it's a very precise, acute comment and with a question, in a sense that you really have in a Western democracy the chance really to change the system? Well, in principle, yes. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was seen as an enemy against the state. But when you get down to it, I mean, you can look at any of the Western democracies, you know, from Canada, United States, even the Nordic countries, there were, and there still are, police surveillance of views which may be considered extremist, and the idea to, for example, make Sweden a communist state would have been seen as, or certainly Canada, I tell you, as an extremist view that is contrary to democracy. So where you draw the lines as to what constitutes democracy and what doesn't, partially, you know, it's a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, you want to say, well, we have to guard democracy. And if you define it very narrowly, then in a way that's an intolerance. And on the other hand, if you allow democracy to be threatened with, you know, sometimes I dream, what if the Bolsheviks had not gotten power and the Mensheviks, who were the majority party, despite the name, you know, minority party, Bolshevik means majority party. What if the Mensheviks had, you know, set up a parliamentary socialist democracy in Russia? The whole world would have been different. And, you know, you see, we lived in Sweden for 5 years. These kids are born in Sweden, in fact, which is really interesting. Socialist principles, human rights, great participation of women, empowerment of women. And, you know, it's a very vibrant democracy in that sense. And I like that very much. It's a left of center political configuration. But, you know, I'm going to Russia in a couple of weeks, and I've gone, I don't know, 4 times before, and I've been around the former Soviet Union. And I sometimes, you know, engage in, you know, some discussions with Lenin or Mao or Stalin, Trotsky, etc. And people say, you know, all that stuff, it really led us into really, really bad hardship. And, you know, if we consider that democracy has to be something where the votes count a lot, voting for different factions in a ruling elite, for me, isn't satisfactory. But neither is, it's not very satisfactory to have Republicans, Democrats, and no third way. That bothers me a lot. I don't, you know, I'd still say that's more democratic than what we saw in the Soviet Union or China, but it's still not very satisfying to me. And in Canada, I'm happy that we have a new Democratic Party, and you know that is a third way. And in the UK, you have the Lib Dems, and you have a different movement. So there seems to be, and this brings me to another point. That is that democracy also depends a lot on how democratic are the parties. How democratic are the parties? How democratic is the party system? Because in a lot of countries, you have, you know, it's a big show. And you have big money politics there, and you have restrictive rules in some way, and you get such rigidity in the party system itself that the Democratic Party system is not democratic. So that's something to look at. And money has a lot to do with it, and corporate influence, and some other things. You know, exclusionary rules that keep people out of voting, etc. We've seen that. So I agree very much with your insight. Any other? I see you. Anybody? Don't be shy, please.
Please.
Here's a couple here.
Thank you. My name is Giulio Colesi. I'm the Vice President of the European Humanist Federation that deals with, let's say, human rights connected with the secularization.
Then you're a friend.
Thank you. I suppose so. And I also had the honor of organizing some events here in Rome with Professor Walston, and thank you very much for cherishing his memory. I have a question for you on a very intractable subject. What if, in some countries, especially non-secularized societies, it is very likely, if not certain, that the exercise of free and fair elections lead to a majority that does not respect human rights and probably prefers to have traditional laws or laws that are not based upon the respect of individual rights enforced if they win. What would the international community, in your opinion, do when dealing with such situations? Thank you.
Thanks. That's an excellent question, and it is, I think you're right, it's very much seemingly intractable, because how can you say that we should have a democracy and then put the limits on, well, we don't like this particular party? This happened, you know, in the West Bank. We all saw the elections. Hamas, you know, horrified a good part of the international community. He said, look, this is what we're going to get. Or in Algeria that I mentioned, they said, you know, the military intervened in 1989. And you get some other possibilities toward theocratic government that may be very retrogressive, secular or theocratic, it doesn't matter. So what do you do in such a case? I think it does come down. There's no automatic, easy, magic wand solution. I think it comes down to, you know, the advance of international comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, you know, friendship and cooperation and engagement. Now, if there's a population that really wants to go backwards in some way with regard to some human rights, they can't go beyond they can't breach their international human rights obligations. And so that actually already acts as a brake. If it's really determined and it says, we don't care about human rights anymore, they're going to suffer the consequences. when governments take a hard line, they start to suffer quite quickly. Tourists say, well, we have a whole map to go to, we're not going to go there. We might get shot at, there might be summary executions, it's not going to be as safe. You know, the influence in multilateral fora is going to drop. But there are hard cases, there are really hard cases. Look at the apartheid regime that took a long time. In South Africa, a lot of pressure that had to be brought to bear. Look at some of the governments going around now where they're going hard line. So I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, I take some comfort that the international human rights system is quite strong and puts a bit of a brake for humanism and respect of human dignity. But I'm worried that it's eroding. Government leaders are not talking about human rights as much as they used to. There's a lot of pushback. NGOs are being restricted in so many countries around the world. Human rights NGOs. I just wrote an article on it, which is edited by Raphael Marchetti, whom you know very well. And so these are very worrying developments. And it means that the struggle has to go on. Does it mean that there shouldn't be a military intervention? That's a whole other area, humanitarian intervention, that I'm very skeptical. That, you know, countries should go and bomb places into democracy or bomb places into human rights. Violence tends to beget violence, and it's not working in Iraq, it's not working in other places. It didn't work in Libya very well. So I would rather see human rights culture, rule of law, democracy percolate up from the bottom, even if there are turns up and down. Let's hope Egypt starts to go along the right path. Tunisia, we're quite enlightened by. Morocco, it's moved quite a lot. If you look, you know, you can throw at any country, I think we can discuss it. I think that the overall trend is a good one, but we can't worry about every single, we can't panic, we have to worry. We can't panic over every bump in the road, because people have to find their own way as well, as long as we don't get to really extremism and serious violations. But there's flexibility, and I hope we'll go in the right direction. So I don't give you a very good answer, but maybe just some thoughts on it. But it's an excellent question. Are we, yeah? Please.
Thank you so much for your presentation and the rest of your work. That's really impressive. I have a couple of comments or observations and questions, so just to give you more chance to clarify some of the concepts. So related to your definition of democracy as something that should be measured in terms of these three categories, I think that's a very smart way of approaching it, but I see a problem with that, because that definition of democracy, that approach to democracy, suffers from the same problem that many other approaches to democracy suffer from, and that is the approach that looks at democracy as basically honorific term rather than descriptive term, because it actually, and it allows for something that we would call a democracy based on those three principles, not to be democratic in the end at all, or be very problematic in some respects. For example, if we take human rights, that really doesn't help us a lot when it comes to, let's say, the corporate sector, that diminishes, I think, democracy to quite a significant extent. And that's where I would also like you to comment more on your optimism, because I see that as a huge problem that actually is going to grow, where you end up in a situation that in most of the Western countries, you have the rights of the corporate sector go way beyond the rights of the individuals. So it's still human rights, it's still rule of law, and yet it diminishes democracy. And that's related also to the graphs that you showed us, because they measure, democracy or no democracy, or less democracy, which is not really what the thing is about, because you can have formally democracy, but in fact plutocracy.
Sure.
And those drafts actually don't depict that. So how would you respond to that? And maybe it's a problem also in just the fact that we have since 1989 this shift in the political spectrum toward the right. So that the traditional understanding of democracy, something that happens between two poles, is not there anymore in many contexts. And it's also interesting that, to me, it was interesting that you answered the previous question with a reference to Francis Fukuyama, which I find interesting because I don't know any of the Fukuyama diagnoses that have proven right. I mean, he's either wrong or just plainly meaningless. So just as in that case of referring to American democracy, just plainly meaningless. So just like, do you have someone else reference better?
Thanks, that's a really excellent set of questions there. Well, on the first part, I would just say 3 words: corporate social responsibility. And that is that there's been a huge movement in the United Nations, which really has been driven by the international community. The United Nations is, the organization of member states, right? To ensure that corporations act in a responsible way, which is the linkage to human rights from the corporate world. Because I think you hit the nail on the head in that human rights is much more than just government protection and promotion of human rights, individual liberties and groups, but it also has to comprehend the role of corporations in a very real way. So that's why I would come back to corporate social responsibility, which is very, very important. But in terms of Fukuyama, you're right. His prescriptions, or his predictions rather, have been hit the end of history and the last man. I mean, that there are no longer any ideological battles. It's a big. When I read that, I was skeptical myself, and then it proved false because we had all the changes at the fall of the Soviet Union, etc. We didn't have perpetual peace. But his analysis is excellent, and that's what I cherish of Francis Fukuyama. He analyzed the situation in the United States very well in the what's it called, I forgot the title of this. It's got a 3-volume set, political rise and decay, I think, something like that. And I think he hit the nail on the head in terms of his analysis. Not in terms of predictions of what could be done about it necessarily, but as an academic, I found his but if you want somebody else, I mean, do we have to go back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels? We can, but that's just a class analysis, which is in many ways outdated. Or Weber, Max Weber. We can go through the classics. I'd be happy to do that in time. But the point is that all of those authors, as the more that they, to quote Marx, the point is not just to describe the world, it's to change it. And human rights is about change. Human rights is about substantive difference in people's lives. And that's why I would respectfully disagree to say that human rights, much more than being a formal concept, or what's in your constitutions, is really how much something is enjoyed. Do you have really a right to free speech? Do you really have the right to access the internet and to get media and to go down the street and feel secure, not to be subject to torture? That's how human rights are measured. And that really has much to do with human beings. And that's very empowering. Because if human rights work well, and we put that as a component to measure democratic governance, I think we're really on the right track. Rule of law is a little bit of a formal concept. Human rights is very, very real. And I know that because, not just because I read it in some books, or I studied it, or I've embraced human rights in my life, in terms of working in it, but because when I travel a lot, I ask people, sometimes they don't understand exactly what human rights means, but when you say, right not to be tortured, we have the president of Amnesty International sitting right here. They will tell you, yeah, we don't care where this concept comes from, but we know we have a right not to be tortured. And we wish our government would respect that. And all the other rights that the people cherish. So I think it is a good indicator. But I really take on board your point which I think was made in an excellent way, that there are other elements there. And depending on which ones you choose, that will color what you call a democracy. I would agree very much with that. And I think it's something to not fall into the trap to say, well, this is a democracy we know because of these indicators and this one is not. There are different ways of looking at it. So I very much appreciate your comment. Did I answer everything? Pretty much. Yeah? Okay, thanks for that insight. Please, go ahead. I have time. I'm used to lecturing for 5 hours at a stretch. Not quite as much as Fidel Castro used to, but...
No, well, thank you very much. It was an excellent presentation. It was, and what I appreciated is how you suggested that democracy is a qualitative concept, and it's important today, I think, with political leaders exploiting a sort of simplistic idea of democracy as being something that has to do basically with numbers. And using democracy against human rights, which may sound a bit like a paradox. But, I mean, basic human rights is something that should be not subject to majority decisions. To the extent that issues become human rights issues for a specific society, that is a moment in which they are no longer the object of decisions that are taken by majority.
They have to be inviolable.
Yeah.
Certain human rights.
I was thinking of the death penalty, which is a controversial issue. It's a human rights issue according to most European views, and therefore not something that can be decided by majority. While the whole debate about the death penalty in the United States has to do with what the majority of the population of the electorate feel about the death penalty, and therefore it remains a sort of political issue and something that is part of the electoral. So I think what is very interesting is precisely this, that sometimes human rights and democracy sort of have this difficult relationship, or complex, difficult is not the right word, complex relationship. So that human rights issues are basically what is not part of the sort of democratic process, but what is part of the core values of the community that is no longer subject to majority decisions. I wonder if you agree with that and if you would like to comment on it.
I very much appreciate your comment. I think it's correct, except to say, I would take a small difference in view to say that from my perspective, human rights has to be part of the democratic process, which you can't override. In other words, the right to life you mentioned, I mean the death penalty. There's certain norms out there that, as you say, quite correctly, should not be subject to majoritarian rule. In other words, you have a right not to be tortured. It doesn't matter if everybody wants to torture you or everybody wants to kill you. And that's the value of human rights. That's the whole concept of human rights. That's why countries after the Second World War, that was the reason, they said we have to place the human rights above countries, up to the international level, so that we have a universal norms. It doesn't depend on your government any longer. Of course, the government has to be the one that's primarily responsible to respect it. You're in contact with the government. You depend on your government. But it's not wholly up to the government. It has to be under international supervision, and the international law has to be superior. For that reason, that there is a restriction on democratic rule or any type of rule. Governments cannot go further than certain limits in the human rights field. So that is part of governance, the right to govern. And it's an international legal norm called international human rights law. So in that sense, especially if you're right, I'm injecting it maybe more than some people might, to say that democracy has to be viewed in a qualitative sense, and that not just a formalistic sense, elections, etc. But that qualitative sense has to be the one from the human rights angle, because that again comes down to individual, I don't want to sound like John Stuart Mill, but pain and pleasure, but your human dignity, to use the language of the UN Charter. So that's why I would say that it's part and parcel of the right to govern, not apart from it.
One minute.
Sure.
Thank you so much. First of all, out of curiosity, the data you brought about regarding Rwanda, all these women in politics, because men were all died, or they all died in the conflict, not because because women really were overrepresenting. Okay.
Go ahead.
My question is, the big question would be, do you believe we can export democracy? And the sub-question would be, there are some scholars who are looking at history and actually argue that there are some cases where this process was actually successful, and they look at Germany or Japan and they compare it to more contemporary sort of experiments. So what would be your two fingers on this?
Yes, thanks. Concerning Rwanda, well, you may know that I was involved in the Security Council investigations of the genocide in 1994. Now, when I was there, I saw as many women victims as men, not to mention children as well. So there wasn't a particular bias. I understand why you might think that there could be a strong gender balance, because historically, traditionally, you're very much correct, used to be on the battlefield, men would be the major, used to be soldiers, now it's civilians of any type. So it was not for that reason. You find, well, when I went there, you didn't find any adults because they were just children there. The perpetrators had fled and the rest were victims. So we just saw children on the streets there in 1994, right after the genocide, who couldn't vote, of course, they were too young. But no, it was an effort of the Paul Kagame's party and his leadership and his government to say we have to have a constitution that is very forward-looking. And I appreciate it very much because he's saying that women have to have a very strong contingent in government, and that even by quota. It's important because, and Ilaria will tell you this much more than I could because her work is dealing a lot of this on this and other areas too, but that the role of women in development is very, very, very important because development funds, development assistance works more when it's targeted towards women. And similarly with voting rights and decision-making power, the more that women can be involved, in the countries where you see women are more fully involved, governance is much stronger. So I think it's an enlightened view that the Rwandan government brought into play, thanks to the leadership of the government and the new constitution. So that's really the reason. On the second part, with regard to exporting democracy, certain exports are dangerous, right? The democracy, there's all sorts of programs that governments have, soft power, to assist governments, technical cooperation. I'm involved with some of these because I'm sometimes going to different countries and talking about human rights, etc., etc. Sometimes funded by governments, mostly by the UN, etc. It's to try to help governments who want to go along the path of better, stronger human rights promotion and protection, etc. So these are very important. But the examples where democracy has really been exported, like you mentioned, Japan, Germany, and you could think of a few other cases. It's been when there's been such a crisis and a breakdown in the old order that you could start tabula rasa, with a blank slate. And it was part of the peace treaty, which is a contradiction in terms. A treaty is usually between two equal parties and an agreement. With a peace treaty, it's probably the only kind of treaty that is under a natural type of duress, because otherwise you're back into war. Sign a peace treaty, or we go back to war. So, and in that certain kind of circumstances, you could say, look, we don't want to fight with you again. Democracies hardly ever go out to war against each other. It's been an observation that I think is correct. So, get your democratic credentials in order. We're going to help you with that. We're going to help you a lot. We're going to make you do this, and we're going to, you know. So those are a few cases where governments are trying to influence clandestinely. You know, it usually backfires. It often backfires. Or if they're trying to push their own system, people resent it. They see this as foreign interference, and that's not good. It has to be organic. It took a long time for European democracies to develop. Nowadays things move more quickly, and it could move much more quickly today than in the past, I believe. But still, it should be homegrown. And you know, I take heart when I go to places like Indonesia, where there's it's a vibrant democracy. Or you know, in Mongolia, there's a lot of democracy there. And you know, Botswana, South Africa. So it may not be a Western democracy, and it may have flaws, but so do Western democracies. So that's why maybe we don't need to export it. We only need to share experiences, and that's a big part of what the UN does. So thanks very much.